She had counted the empty chairs without meaning to. 102 of them, dressed in ivory linen, arranged in perfect rows beneath crystal chandeliers that threw soft gold light across a ballroom that smelled of white roses and warm candle wax, and not a single one of them held a person. Victoria Hayes sat beside her birthday cake in her wheelchair at 7:14 in the evening and looked out across that room the way a person looks at something they already understand but are not yet ready to accept. The cake had 3 tiers. The frosting was the color of cream. The candles had been burning for 19 minutes. She had not blown them out because blowing them out would mean admitting that no one was coming, and she was not ready to do that yet, even though every message on her phone had already told her so. The last cancellation had arrived at 6:57, a brief apology from her college roommate of 21 years, something about a delayed flight, something that had the careful smoothness of a message composed in advance. Victoria had set the phone face down on the tablecloth and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the door. The door had not opened. The clock on the wall moved from 7 to 7:05 to 7:10 without ceremony. Somewhere in the kitchen, a dish clinked against another dish. Somewhere outside, the city of Chicago continued its Friday evening without noticing that inside this room, one of the most successful women in American business was sitting completely alone on her 45th birthday, and the silence around her was so complete she could hear the candles burning. Victoria Margaret Hayes had not built her life to arrive at silence. She had built it to mean something. At 26, she launched her cybersecurity company from a rented 2-room office with a second-hand laptop and a business plan written in longhand in a spiral notebook, driven by the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told more than once that she was aiming too high. By 42, she employed 900 people across 6 states. Her photograph had appeared on the covers of 3 national business magazines. She gave keynote addresses at industry conferences where people stood to applaud before she reached the podium simply because of the reputation that walked in ahead of her. She had friends then, or people she had believed were friends, people who filled her calendar and her dinner table and her weekends with noise and warmth and the comfortable feeling of being known. She had a house on Lake Michigan with tall windows that caught the morning light, and she had an active life, hiking trips and charity galas and cross-country flights for meetings that mattered. And she had been, by every visible measure, a woman whose life was full. The accident happened in a December evening 3 years ago when the roads were glazed with the kind of ice that looks like wet pavement until your tires find the truth of it. She was driving home from a charity fundraiser for a children's hospital. She remembers the headlights of the other car coming across the center line. She does not remember much after that. She woke 4 days later in a hospital room crowded with flowers and learned from a doctor who delivered the news with genuine gentleness that her spine had been damaged in a way that could not be repaired. She listened without crying. The crying came later, in the dark, when the room was empty and there was nothing between her and the future she was going to have to rebuild from.
A seated position. She rebuilt it. That part was true. She returned to her company within 4 months, and within 2 years her business was larger than it had been before. Magazines called her unstoppable. She kept that word at a careful distance because she understood that unstoppable was what people said when they wanted to praise your output without asking about your interior. What no one wrote about, what no profile captured, was the way the phone had grown quieter in the years after the accident, the way certain friendships had thinned and then dissolved, not in conflict, not in anger, but in the slow drift of people who did not know how to be close to a life that had changed shape. The way her business relationships had remained professional and warm and entirely surface. The way her house on the lake had become very still in the evenings. She had thrown every part of herself into her work because work was the place where she still made complete sense, where her mind moved the way it always had, fast and precise and purposeful. But there is a difference between a life that is productive and a life that is full, and Victoria had lived inside that difference for 3 years without saying so to anyone, because there was no one left to say it to. Across the city, Ethan Brooks was carrying the last grocery order of his Friday shift to the service elevator of the Harrington Grand Hotel on Michigan Avenue. He was 39 years old, and he moved through the world with the particular economy of someone who has long since wasted energy on anything that is not essential. His jacket had the logo of the delivery company on the left chest. His boots were worn at the heels in a way he had been meaning to address for several months. He was tired in the way he was always tired on Fridays, which was not the tiredness of a body that had done too much, but the tiredness of a man who had been the only adult in a household for 5 years and had learned to carry that weight so consistently that he no longer noticed he was carrying it, except on evenings like this one, when the silence of the van on the drive home reminded him. His wife Sarah had died of cancer 5 years ago. Grace was 6 years old. There were things about those early years after Sarah that Ethan did not talk about because talking about them did not help, and because Grace needed him to be steady, and so he had become steady, methodically and completely, the way a person becomes whatever the people they love most require them to be. He thought about Sarah every day, not always with grief anymore, because grief had gradually become something quieter, something closer to a presence than an absence, the way the memory of someone deeply loved eventually stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like a companion. He thought about her most when Grace did something that reminded him of her, which happened often because Grace had inherited her mother's particular quality of attention, that way of noticing the specific detail that most people walk past. Grace was 11 now, and she was with him that evening, as she was most Fridays, sitting in the passenger seat of the delivery van, with a library book open across her knees and her face turned toward the window as they drove down Michigan Avenue. She looked up at the Harrington Grand as they pulled around to the service entrance and said nothing, but Ethan noticed the way she looked at the building's lit windows with the thoughtful expression she wore
when something was working itself out behind her eyes. She came with him to the service entrance and waited in the corridor while he completed the delivery, talking briefly with the receiving chef, a broad-shouldered man named Douglas, who had worked hotel kitchens for 3 decades and who shook his head slowly as he signed the paperwork. Ethan asked him what was wrong. Douglas set down his pen. He said there was a woman in the main ballroom who had rented the entire space for her birthday, said over 100 people had confirmed they were coming, said not one of them had shown up. Ethan looked at him. Douglas nodded. He said it plain, without any performance of sadness, simply stating a fact that was sad enough on its own. Ethan finished the delivery and walked back toward the corridor where Grace was waiting. He passed the ballroom entrance without planning to stop, but he slowed, and through the narrow gap between the partially open doors, he saw the room, all that light and all those flowers and all those empty chairs, and the woman at the center of it. She was sitting in a wheelchair beside a birthday cake that still had its candles burning, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned slightly away from the door, with the quiet dignity of someone enduring something difficult in a public place. She was not crying. She was not on her phone. She was simply present inside her own stillness, in the way of someone who has long since learned that falling apart is a luxury not always available to people who have learned to hold themselves together. Ethan stood in the corridor and looked at her and felt something move in his chest. Not pity, because pity requires distance, but recognition, the specific recognition of someone who knew what it felt like to be in a room where the people you expected were no longer there. Grace appeared beside him and looked through the same gap. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked very softly whether the woman was alone. Ethan said yes. Grace looked down at the floor and then back through the door. She said, "We should go in, Dad." Ethan told her they didn't know this woman. Grace said, "She doesn't know us either, but she's alone on her birthday, Dad." He looked at his daughter, 11 years old, serious and certain, and he thought about Sarah, who believed without qualification that kindness was not a feeling, but a decision, and that the decision was always available, regardless of circumstance. He straightened his jacket.
He knocked gently on the open ballroom door.
Victoria turned at the sound. The man standing in the doorway was not anyone she had invited. He was not wearing a suit. He was not carrying flowers or a gift bag or any of the things the evening had been planned around. He was wearing a work jacket with a logo on the chest, and he had the look of someone who had spent the day doing something physical and useful. And beside him stood a little girl in a blue coat, holding a small painted picture frame in both hands with the careful grip of someone carrying something that matters. The man introduced himself as Ethan. He said they had not been invited, and he was sorry to interrupt. He said his daughter had not been able to walk past. His voice was quiet and direct and carried none of the performance that Victoria had grown accustomed to from people in her professional world. Grace stepped forward. She held the frame out with both hands, the way children offer things they mean entirely. Victoria took it. She turned it over. She opened the folded paper inside and read the 6 words Grace had written in pencil on wide-lined notebook paper during a Friday afternoon art class. Some families are born. Some find each other. Victoria read the words once. She read them again. Then she pressed the frame against her chest and closed her eyes, and the tears came. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, unstoppable way of something that has been held back for a very long time. She did not cry because the gift was expensive or because the words were eloquent. She cried because in 3 years of building and achieving and persisting, no one had chosen her simply because she was there and she was a person and she deserved not to be alone. This child had. This tired man in worn boots had, and that was everything. Grace put her arms around Victoria without asking permission, the way children offer comfort before the adult world teaches them to hesitate, and Victoria held on with both arms, and the two of them stayed like that in the middle of the empty ballroom while the birthday candles burned down toward their holders, and the white roses stood in their vases, and the crystal chandeliers threw their gold light across 102 chairs that had been empty all evening and now no longer felt like an accusation. The hotel staff had been watching from the edges of the room with the careful discretion of people trained not to intrude. But something shifted. The pianist, who had been packing his sheet music to leave, returned to the bench and began playing something slow and undemanding, a melody that made room for emotion without demanding it. A waitress named Carol brought 2 plates from the kitchen, food that would have gone to waste, and set them at the table without saying anything. Then another staff member brought plates, then another. A bellhop named Marcus, who had been heading home, sat down instead. A housekeeper named Patricia, who had worked a double shift, pulled out a chair and stayed. The pastry assistant relit the birthday candles with a long wooden match. The chef cut the first slice of the 3-tiered cake. Within an hour, the ballroom that had been entirely empty held nearly 30 people, none of them wealthy, none of them famous, none of them on any list Victoria had ever written. They were simply people who had decided, without being asked, that this mattered. Ethan sat across from Victoria, and they talked with the way people talk when they have stopped performing and started being honest. He told her about Sarah, about the years that followed, about the specific texture of raising a child alone, the way love expands to fill the space left by grief if you allow it to, the way Grace had become not just his daughter, but his reason for the particular kind of steadiness he had built in himself. Victoria listened with her full attention, the way she had once listened in meetings where everything was at stake, because everything was at stake. Then she spoke. She told him about the accident, about learning to live in a wheelchair in a world designed for people who stand, about the way success had continued growing while the circle of genuine friendship had quietly contracted until the house on the lake was so still some mornings that she could hear the refrigerator hum from the 2nd floor. She said it without self-pity, which made it more moving than self-pity ever could have been.
Ethan did not offer solutions or silver linings. He simply stayed present with what she had said, which was the only thing that was needed. Before they left, Grace looked at Victoria with the clear directness of children who have not yet learned to soften everything they mean. She asked if Victoria would come to their neighborhood sometime. She said there was a good bakery on the corner that made cinnamon rolls on Saturday mornings. Victoria looked at this child who had walked into a stranger's grief with a painted picture frame and 6 penciled words and changed the entire shape of an evening, and she said yes. She said she promised. Grace nodded, satisfied, because for her the matter was settled, and promises meant what they said. 6 weeks later, Victoria called her board of directors together and told them she was establishing a non-profit. She was funding it from her own resources. She named it the Open Chair Foundation because the image that had stayed with her since that Friday evening was not the chairs that had been empty and waiting for people who never came, but the chairs that had been pulled out by people who owed her nothing and stayed anyway. The foundation's purpose was to find people spending the significant moments of their lives in isolation, elderly men and women in care facilities, veterans alone in small apartments, grieving parents, children without support, and to make sure someone showed up. Not with cameras, not with speeches, simply with presence, which is the oldest and most irreducible form of love. She asked Ethan to serve as community outreach director. He laughed and said he was a delivery driver without a nonprofit degree. Victoria said the most essential qualification for the work was something no institution could teach or certify. She said he had already demonstrated it on a Friday evening when he could have walked past a set of open ballroom doors and hadn't. She said she was asking him to keep doing what he had already shown he knew how to do, only now with resources behind him. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said yes. The work of the Open Chair Foundation did not make headlines in its early months because genuine compassion rarely does. It happened in ordinary places, on ordinary days. It happened wherever someone had decided that another person's aloneness was worth doing something about. Grace became part of that work in the way that children become part of things when they have been raised to believe that showing up is not optional. 1 year after the birthday that no one came to, Victoria sat in the same ballroom beneath a new banner beside a new cake and looked out across a room that was full. Not with executives or public figures or anyone whose presence would have photographed well, full with people whose lives had been found by the simple act of being noticed. Veterans, single parents, teachers, nurses, neighbors, children who had been remembered on their birthdays by strangers who would never ask for anything in return. And at the center of the room, standing together near the birthday cake, were a delivery driver in a clean shirt and an 11-year-old girl in a yellow dress who had once walked through a door with a painted frame and a folded piece of notebook paper and reminded one of the most successful women in America of the one thing that success, for all its power, cannot manufacture: the knowledge that you are chosen. That someone saw you in your loneliness and decided you were worth walking toward. That somewhere in this enormous and often indifferent world, you are not forgotten. If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you that the most powerful thing one human being can offer another is simply to show up, please subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories. Every week we bring you stories about ordinary people doing quietly extraordinary things in the spaces between the headlines. Press that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so that none of these stories ever pass you by. This channel is for people who still believe in the goodness of ordinary life. We are grateful you are here with us. This story speaks honestly to the epidemic of social isolation, which affects millions of Americans across every income level and social circumstance, and which research increasingly identifies as one of the most serious threats to long-term physical and emotional health. It demonstrates that human connection requires no qualification, no shared background, and no invitation, only the willingness to notice another person and act on that noticing. It portrays disability with dignity and full complexity, showing a wheelchair user as a complete human being defined entirely by her inner life and her choices. It honors single fatherhood and the quiet daily heroism of parents raising children alone with love and integrity. It shows children as moral agents capable of genuine compassion, offering older viewers a portrait of the next generation that is hopeful and real. And it reminds every viewer, regardless of their circumstances, that the relationships worth having are not the ones built on obligation or proximity or professional courtesy, but the ones in which someone, without any reason other than basic human decency, decided you were worth choosing.